The sweat running down Klaus Zimmermann's face had nothing to do with the August heat. The 19-year-old loader from Munich pressed his eye against the Zeiss rangefinder of his 88mm Flak 36 and counted the silver dots climbing toward 27,000 feet. Dozens of B-17s, part of a much larger bomber formation, were flying toward the Flak position outside Schweinfurt. Around him, his 9 crewmates worked in quick and silent motions, but Klaus still noticed the small shake in Werner's hands. The young fuse setter who had joined them only 3 days earlier, after the last man in that job was killed by an American fighter attack. It was 11:47 a.m., August 17th, 1943. By sunset, 7 of these 10 men would be dead. But why? Why did Flak units suffer such heavy losses, with many batteries losing more than half of their men in only a few months? Why did a job behind a heavy gun become almost a one-way ticket? The answer is cold math, math that no amount of courage could escape. Flak batteries stood exactly where enemy bombers wanted to strike: factories, bridges, rail lines, and cities. Many field Flak crews had only light protection, but the fixed positions around major cities often included walls, shelters, and reinforced structures. And every time they fired, the bright muzzle flash and burning tracer shells told every airplane in the sky, "Here we are." The enemy listened. The enemy learned fast. And soon they built weapons whose only purpose was simple: kill Flak crews first. The numbers tell the rest. Imagine 10 young men standing in a line, and then imagine 8 of them gone. That was the life of an 88mm crew. Most casualties came from fighter-bomber attacks, airburst bombs, and artillery fire, although there are no official records showing exact percentages for each cause. The rest came from counter-artillery, accidents, friendly fire, illness, and exhaustion. To understand how extreme this was, remember, German infantry on the Eastern Front often suffered very heavy losses, and many divisions lost between 50 and 70% of their men during major battles. The losses of German tank crews changed greatly from one front to another, and some units were hit very hard, but there is no single percentage that describes all of them. More than 400,000 members of the Flak arm, including many teenage helpers who were called into service, were killed during the war. One survivor later said, "By 1944, a Flak gunner with 6 months of experience was a miracle." But our story does not begin with the blood and fire of 1944. It begins much earlier, with a secret design in the early 1930s, at a time when Germany was not even allowed to build such weapons. From the late 1920s, Germany developed new anti-aircraft guns through Bofors in Sweden to avoid international inspection. And by 1933, the 8.8cm Flak 18 was completed. The treaty that ended the First World War had been designed to keep Germany weak, unable to threaten its neighbors again. But behind those closed doors, the future was being forged in steel and mathematics. The engineers faced a problem that seemed almost impossible. Aircraft were flying higher and faster than ever before. Strategic bombers being developed in other countries could reach altitudes beyond existing weapons' reach, while carrying payloads powerful enough to flatten entire city blocks. Germany needed something revolutionary, something that could reach into the stratosphere and pull those bombers from the sky. The requirements were daunting. The weapon needed to fire high-velocity shells reaching 26,000 feet or higher. It needed accuracy at extreme ranges. It needed mobility, able to be moved by truck. And it needed operation by crews who could work quickly under pressure, tracking targets moving at unprecedented speeds. Early prototypes failed repeatedly. Some couldn't achieve required muzzle velocity. Recoil broke carriages. Barrels wore out too quickly. But by 1933, they achieved their breakthrough. The combination of a long barrel, a cruciform carriage providing stability, and a semi-automatic breech allowing rapid firing came together in what would become known as the 8.8cm Flak 18. Flak was short for Fliegerabwehrkanone, literally aircraft defense cannon in German. But the word would catch on and become a term Allied airmen spoke with a mixture of respect and dread. Even today, English speakers use flak to mean heavy criticism, a linguistic legacy of these deadly guns. One engineer involved in the project may have captured both the triumph and shadow of their creation in notes that survived the war. Some writers after the war described the mood among engineers at the time, suggesting that they understood the terrible power of the weapon they were creating. The gun that emerged was remarkable by any measure. Weighing about 7 tons, it required 10 men to operate effectively. It could elevate from -3 degrees to 85 degrees, giving it an extraordinary range of motion. That high elevation was intended for anti-aircraft work, but the ability to depress slightly below horizontal would soon prove valuable in unexpected ways. The muzzle velocity, around 2,700 feet per second, gave shells a flat trajectory and tremendous striking power. The effective ceiling of 26,000 feet meant it could reach most bombers of the era. And with a well-trained crew, it could fire up to 20 rounds per minute, filling the sky with explosive shells. Each shell weighed about 9.4 kilograms, with roughly 1 kilogram of explosive filler designed to fragment into deadly shrapnel upon detonation. The shells used mechanical time fuses, set before loading to explode at specific altitudes calculated to intercept targets. When everything worked perfectly, a bomber several miles above would find itself centered in an explosion that turned metal fragments into supersonic projectiles. The engineers had designed for one purpose: shooting down aircraft. But the 88mm became a strong anti-tank gun because of its very high muzzle velocity and the armor-piercing ammunition developed later, and this role came from its technical qualities, not from an accidental feature, one that would put crew members in even greater danger. By the time prototypes existed, Germany was already planning for war. The gun worked in tests and on paper, but warfare is written in blood, not blueprints. The 88 needed its baptism of fire. November 1936. The Spanish Civil War had been raging for months, tearing that country apart in what would prove a dress rehearsal for the larger conflict to come. Germany sent the Condor Legion to support nationalist forces, including several batteries of the new 88mm guns for combat evaluation. The crews were volunteers, career soldiers, true believers, men who followed orders. They set up positions around Madrid and waited for Republican bombers to appear. Fighter pilot Werner Mulders, who later became a well-known ace, also served in Spain during the Civil War. It is possible that pilots like him saw the 88mm guns in action, but there is no confirmed record that Mulders himself watched their first battle. The shells created perfect black puffs around the formation. One account suggests, he said, within minutes, 3 bombers were falling. Our pilots celebrated, but I noticed something the gun crews couldn't see from the ground: the Republican fighters diving toward their position. That was the first hard lesson Spain taught. The guns were spectacularly effective, but the moment they fired, they announced their position to everyone in the sky. And there were always fighters looking for targets. The first crew casualties shocked the German command. These were supposed to be anti-aircraft weapons, shooting at targets that couldn't effectively shoot back. But in the chaos of battle, everything changed. Fighters strafed gun positions, artillery targeted them. Even surviving bombers sometimes dropped payloads on the flashes they'd seen from the ground. Around late 1936 near Toledo, German crews used the 88mm guns against Soviet-made T-26 tanks for the first time. Reports from the period mention that the guns were effective, although the exact number of tanks destroyed is not confirmed. A battery commander made a battlefield decision born of necessity rather than doctrine. He ordered his crews to depress their guns and fire directly at the advancing tanks. What happened next was recorded in combat reports that still exist in German military archives. According to these reports, the battery destroyed 7 enemy tanks at ranges between 800 and 1,200 meters. The high-velocity armor-piercing shells penetrated cleanly. But the report included a sobering note. During this engagement, we lost 3 men to enemy machine gun fire. Fighting ground targets exposes the crew completely. That last sentence proved prophetic. Against aircraft thousands of feet away, crews had some protection. The enemy was distant, moving fast, trying to hit a small target while under fire. But against ground targets, the gun crew was in direct line of sight. Everyone could see them. Everyone could shoot at them. One veteran returning from Spain, according to accounts that survived, tried to warn replacement crews during training sessions. We thought we were the hunters, shooting at planes that couldn't shoot back effectively. He reportedly told them, "We learned we were also the hunted. Every time we fired, we announced our position. Every enemy in the sky wanted us dead." When the Condor Legion returned to Germany, total losses from all units were around 300 men. The number of casualties among the 88mm gun crews is unknown, but was likely much smaller. High for peacetime, but acceptable for limited war. Spain had been a testing ground. What was coming would be total war, and the mathematics would change completely. By 1939, as Germany prepared for full-scale war, the 88 had evolved from a promising design into arguably the most sophisticated anti-aircraft system in the world. But sophistication brought complexity, and complexity required skilled crews who would become increasingly scarce. The Flak 36, introduced in the mid-1930s, brought several improvements. The barrel was now built in sections, making replacement easier when wear reduced accuracy. The new Lafette 36 carriage allowed faster deployment. They added a steel shield to protect crews from shrapnel and small arms fire. A gunnery instructor teaching new crews might have pointed at that shield with mixed feelings. It stops splinters and small arms fire, but it won't stop a 500-pound bomb. When bombers come directly overhead, that shield is psychological comfort, nothing more. The Flak 37, arriving by the late 1930s, brought more significant advances. Enhanced targeting instruments improved aiming precision. But the critical innovation was the data transmission system connecting individual guns to a central fire control unit. This improvement made the 88 more effective and placed it among the most advanced anti-aircraft systems of its time, similar to those developed in Britain and the United States. What made the 88 genuinely dangerous wasn't just the gun itself, but the elaborate fire control system developed to aim it. This was analog computing before computers existed, a mechanical brain calculating trajectories faster than any human could. The early fire control systems, such as the Commando Girard 36, already showed advanced engineering for the time. Later models, like the Commando Girard 40, improved accuracy and became standard during World War II. Consider the mathematics involved. A bomber at 25,000 feet was 4.7 miles above the guns. A shell fired at that altitude needed 22 seconds to reach detonation height. During those 22 seconds, a bomber traveling at 180 miles per hour covered over half a mile. The fire control computer had to calculate where the bomber would be 22 seconds in the future, adjust for wind, air pressure, temperature, barrel wear, and powder charge variations, then transmit that solution to multiple guns simultaneously. The system used optical rangefinders, acoustic locators early in the war. Later versions of the Würzburg radar could track targets up to about 40 kilometers away. The larger Würzburg Riese model, introduced later in the war, reached about 70 kilometers. A man who operated the Commando Girard during the war, interviewed decades later, tried to explain the reality behind the technology. "People think the gun crew had the dangerous job," he recalled. "They don't realize we were just as exposed. The Commando Girard crew usually worked a short distance from the guns, depending on the terrain. Because their equipment was important, they often became targets once enemy pilots spotted their position. Kill the computer crew, and the entire battery fires blind. The ammunition revealed one of Germany's critical weaknesses. Shells used mechanical time fuses set before loading to explode at predetermined altitudes. This required perfect calculation. If calculations were wrong by even 1 second, shells missed by 500 feet or more. The Allies, meanwhile, developed VT proximity fuses using miniaturized radio systems to detect aircraft and detonate automatically. These were so closely guarded that strict orders prohibited their use over land, where Germans might recover unexploded shells. Proximity fuses increased Allied anti-aircraft effectiveness by roughly 300%. Germany attempted similar development, but never succeeded in mass production. German Flak remained dependent on precise calculation and, truthfully, luck. In early war years, with well-trained crews and good fire control, it might take 2,000 to 4,000 shells to destroy a single bomber. By 1943, as Allied countermeasures like chaff and electronic jammers appeared, that number climbed to 8,000 or more. By late 1944, it sometimes required 16,000 shells for a single confirmed kill. Each technological advancement made the 88 more effective at killing aircraft, but each advancement also made crews more valuable targets. More sophisticated fire control required more specialists. More specialists concentrated around guns made more lucrative targets for attacking aircraft. It was a vicious circle that would grind thousands of young men into statistics. By September 1939, Germany possessed 2,658 88mm flak guns, twice Britain's anti-aircraft arsenal and more than America had in total. The weapons were ready. Tactics were developed. Production was ramping up. But weapons require operators, and operators die. Few realized that serving these magnificent guns would become one of the deadliest jobs in the Wehrmacht. When German forces invaded Poland on September 1, 1939, 88mm crews expected to face the Polish Air Force. Instead, many found themselves aiming at fortifications, and that first month confirmed what Spain had suggested. This anti-aircraft gun could kill anything. Early months revealed a strange reality. The Luftwaffe dominated skies so completely that anti-aircraft batteries often had little to do in their primary role. Polish aircraft were destroyed on the ground or shot down by fighters. The pattern repeated in France. German air superiority was so overwhelming that flak crews sometimes went days without seeing enemy aircraft. But there were French and British tanks to deal with, and some were heavily armored in ways that surprised German planners. May 21, 1940, near Arras, in northern France. Erwin Rommel, commanding the 7th Panzer Division, watched his 37mm anti-tank guns bounce shells harmlessly off British Matilda tanks advancing through wheat fields. The heavily armored British tanks shrugged off every hit, crushing German positions. Rommel's division faced being overrun. The order Rommel gave was born of desperation. All guns, including the flak, will engage the armor. One flak crew member, years later, might have remembered that moment with conflicted feelings. Records suggest crews destroyed tanks easily. Shells went through armor cleanly at ranges exceeding 1,500 meters. But fighting tanks meant being in direct line of sight. British infantry could see them clearly. Machine gun fire reportedly killed loaders. Others lost limbs to shell splinters. They stopped the tanks, but the price was high, because fighting in direct view of enemy infantry and guns was usually more dangerous than firing at aircraft far above them. Rommel's official report was enthusiastic about the success. What it didn't emphasize was the cost. But the success overshadowed the losses, setting a dangerous precedent. The gun designed to reach into the sky would increasingly fight at eye level, exposing crews to every weapon on the battlefield. Through 1940, casualty rates remained relatively low, perhaps a quarter of personnel experiencing some form of casualty. Training accidents, combat exposure, mechanical failures happened, but numbers were manageable. The Luftwaffe controlled skies, meaning limited danger from primary threats. Everything changed June 22, 1941, when Operation Barbarossa launched against the Soviet Union. The Eastern Front was different from everything before. The Soviet Air Force outnumbered Germans roughly 3-1. Yes, the Soviets suffered devastating initial losses, caught by surprise, but sheer numbers meant constant aerial threat. 88mm crews suddenly faced hundreds of targets daily. Then there was Soviet armor. The KV-1 heavy tank shocked German forces when first encountered. Standard anti-tank guns proved virtually useless against it. Reports from the Eastern Front showed that the KV-1 was very hard to knock out, and some German crews later remembered firing many 88mm rounds at a single tank while taking losses themselves. That battery commander had identified the mathematical problem haunting German forces for the rest of the war. The 80s were effective against Soviet armor. Soviet armor greatly outnumbered German tanks. Therefore, 80s 8s were essential for ground combat. But every ground engagement exposed crews to retaliation. And air defense still required those same guns. Result: crews fighting 2 wars simultaneously, doubling danger exposure. By the early war years, the Luftwaffe began to use more support staff, and thousands of women served in communications and administrative roles. From 1943, whole classes of Hitler Youth boys were drafted as Flak helpers and sent to anti-aircraft units, where many of them faced real combat for the first time. One woman who served, interviewed decades later, remembered her introduction to the reality. They told us women would only operate radar and telephone safely behind lines. The first week, I watched 2 girls from my training group die when American fighters strafed our position. The shells don't care if you're male or female. By the end of 1941, Germany had already deployed several thousand 88mm guns, and the Flak arm was growing quickly in both guns and manpower, but detailed yearly casualty figures for that period are not available in reliable sources. The pattern was established. The 88 was indispensable against aircraft, tanks, fortifications. But indispensable weapons require crews, and crews were dying faster than training could replace them with skilled operators. The year 1942 dawned with Germany still confident. By 1943's end, Flak crews knew they were doomed. In those 2 years, industrial warfare's mathematics ground hundreds of thousands into blood and statistics. Allied intelligence officers interrogated every captured Flak crewman they could find. They studied every gun position from reconnaissance photographs. They analyzed every engagement, searching for weaknesses, ways to kill the men operating these deadly weapons. They learned 3 critical facts. Flak batteries were positioned around high-value targets. Once they fired, the position was revealed. Crews were exposed, vulnerable, essential. Tactical response developed gradually but inexorably. Fighters received specific missions to suppress Flak. They approached from the sun when possible, attacking during bomber runs when gun crews focused on aircraft thousands of feet above. Orders were clear: focus on the crew, not the gun itself. Crews couldn't take cover quickly. Kill them, and guns become useless. Allied air forces began to use fragmentation and cluster bombs more often, and many of these weapons were set to explode in the air over gun positions, sending deadly steel down on Flak crews and other ground targets, turning space around an 88 into a zone of shredding metal. Bomber formations began noting Flak positions as they passed. Following waves targeted those positions specifically. Artillery and mortars engaged known sites. The hunters were becoming systematically hunted. August 17, 1942, marked the first American daylight raid on occupied Europe. 12 B-17 bombers attacked rail yards at Rouen-Sotteville in France. German Flak batteries opened fire enthusiastically, shooting down Zero bombers, but revealing positions with perfect clarity. American pilots noted every gun emplacement. The next raid hit those positions first. Letters home from battery commanders during this period, preserved by families, track the growing nightmare. Early 1942 letters spoke of confidence, good positions, minimal casualties. By late 1942, tones changed. Massive formations, tremendous ammunition expenditure, losing good men, receiving replacements with inadequate training. By early 1943, despair crept in. Original crews nearly gone, replacements were children and grandfathers, specialists arriving with weeks instead of months of training. On August 17, 1943, the Americans sent 376 B-17 bombers against Regensburg and Schweinfurt, and 230 of these bombers went to the ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt. The USAF lost 60 B-17s on the whole mission, and the Schweinfurt force alone lost 36 bombers, with hundreds of aircrew killed, captured, or interned. German sources do not give clear figures for Flak crew casualties in this battle, but the heavy losses on both sides showed how deadly the air war over Germany had become. Survivors received replacements within 3 days. None had seen combat. Training averaged 3 weeks. On October 14, 1943, later called Black Thursday, 291 B-17s went back to Schweinfurt. The USAF lost 77 bombers and suffered around 600 aircrew killed or missing over enemy territory, plus many more wounded on aircraft that struggled home. German records again do not list clear casualty numbers for the Flak units, but both sides agreed that the cost of these unescorted daylight raids had become unsustainable. After Black Thursday, something changed in how men viewed flak duty. According to survivor accounts, no one volunteered afterward. It became a punishment assignment. German industry built tens of thousands of 88mm guns during the war, and by mid-1944 there were about 10,700 heavy 88mm pieces in service, along with many other flak guns. Ground-based air defense used more than 1 million personnel, but historians do not agree on precise yearly casualty totals for 1942 and 1943. Training once taking 6 months was reduced to 4 to 6 weeks. By the later years of the war, the Flak arm drew people from almost every part of German society. Hundreds of thousands of teenage Hitler Youth boys served as flak helpers, older reservists and wounded veterans filled gun crews, and large numbers of women worked as auxiliaries in communications and control centers. One Hitler Youth survivor, interviewed as an old man, remembered reporting at 16. "I lied and said I was 17. They didn't care. I was big enough to load shells. That was all that mattered. 3 weeks training, then sent to a battery near Hamburg. The sergeant who received me looked at my hands, soft, no calluses, and said, 'You have 2 weeks. Learn everything or die ignorant.' He was being kind. He was telling the truth." Schweinfurt proved something defining the rest of the war. Allied production could sustain losses that would cripple Germany. America built aircraft faster than Germany could shoot them down, but Germany couldn't build crews faster than Allies could kill them. The asymmetry was becoming undeniable. By January 1944, serving on an 88mm flak gun was no longer just a dangerous job. It felt like a slow death sentence. Flak crews suffered very heavy losses, and many of them did not survive more than a few months at the front, although we do not have exact numbers for their life expectancy. Infantry on the Eastern Front and U-boat crews also paid a terrible price, and the submarine arm in particular lost about 70% of its men during the war. In this world of extreme risk, standing beside an anti-aircraft gun under enemy air superiority was one of the most dangerous jobs a German soldier could have, and many gunners felt they were simply waiting their turn to die. When Allied forces landed at Normandy, June 6, 1944, German flak batteries along the Atlantic Wall faced concentrated firepower of the entire Allied Air Force plus naval bombardment. According to accounts, batteries in concrete emplacements above the beaches faced systematic destruction. Battleship 14-inch shells weighing 1,500 pounds targeted coastal flak positions. Destroyers added 5-inch guns. Bombers dropped 500 and 1,000-pound bombs. Fighter bombers strafed anything moving. Barrages lasting 45 minutes or more reportedly turned fortified positions into rubble, entombing crews or killing them through concussion alone. Statistics from Normandy in June to August 1944 show that German flak units suffered very heavy losses, but exact numbers for every battery and every gun are hard to verify today. Many batteries along the invasion front were destroyed or overrun, and a large number of 88mm guns were knocked out by naval fire, bombing, and ground attacks. In the first days after D-Day, hundreds of flak crewmen were killed, wounded, or captured, and by the end of the Normandy campaign, the German air defense network in the region was badly shattered. Over the Reich itself, strategic bombing reached peak intensity. By mid-1944, Allied bombers flew daylight missions with near impunity. P-51 Mustangs escorted them anywhere in Germany. Flak remained the only effective defense, but flak required crews, and crews died faster than they could be replaced. British bombers at night, American bombers during the day. German flak crews worked shifts, 4 hours on, 4 hours off if lucky. They ate at positions. They slept standing when possible. They fought twice daily and died steadily. One survivor tried explaining that existence. We learned to sleep standing up. British came at night with incendiaries. We'd fire blindly into darkness, hoping to hit something. At dawn, we'd clear spent casings and prepare for Americans. They came in daylight, perfect formations. We could see them. They could see us. Mutual slaughter, but they had more planes than we had shells. By late 1944, the German training system for flak crews was collapsing under pressure. Before the war, gunners and technical specialists could spend many months in training schools, and even in the early war years, instruction was still fairly thorough. As losses mounted and demand for new crews exploded, courses became shorter and more rushed. Many late-war recruits received only a brief period of basic training and a few weeks of instruction on the guns before being sent straight into combat. One instructor, interviewed after the war, explained the impossible situation. How do you teach a 16-year-old to operate sophisticated weapons in 2 weeks? You don't. You teach him to load, aim, fire. You teach him to duck. You don't teach maintenance, tactics, survival. There isn't time. You shake his hand, look him in the eye, and pray he remembers something when bombers come. Most didn't live long enough to learn from mistakes. By January 1945, Germany was dying. So were flak crews. Ammunition rationing began February. Batteries limited to 200 rounds per day per gun. This meant engage only high-value targets, no ranging shots, no training for new crews. Manpower crisis reached absurd levels. By March 1945, flak batteries reportedly included boys as young as 14. Men as old as 65 stood beside them. Severely wounded soldiers, some missing limbs, operated positions not requiring full mobility. Women operated guns officially, not just auxiliary roles. Impressed foreign laborers, prisoners, Volkssturm militia, anyone who could lift a shell was put to work. Records suggest that by war's end, some battery commanders were barely 21, commanding children and grandfathers with inadequate ammunition and no hope. Exact casualty figures for German flak personnel are difficult to reconstruct because many records were destroyed, and the flak arm included soldiers, auxiliaries, civilians, and foreign workers. Historians estimate that about 1.2 million people served in ground-based air defenses by the end of the war, and that their losses were very heavy, especially in 1944 to 1945. Tens of thousands of flak gunners were killed or wounded, and units manning 88mm guns often suffered higher casualty rates than other branches because their positions were so visible and so frequently attacked. It is clear that a large share of those who served on heavy guns did not survive the war unhurt, but we cannot honestly say that 4 out of 5 were killed or seriously wounded. May 8, 1945. The guns fell silent. Survivors counted their dead and wondered why they lived. Allied forces capturing German territory found remains of what had been a massive air defense network. Over 21,000 88mm guns of various models produced during the war. Perhaps 4,000 to 5,000 survived in working condition. The rest, destroyed, damaged, abandoned. Near major flak positions, mass graves held hundreds of bodies. After the war, the US Strategic Bombing Survey and later studies tried to measure the effect of German air defenses. They showed that anti-aircraft guns, including the 88mm, were responsible for a very large share of American bomber losses in Europe, roughly around 40 to 50%, while fighters caused most of the rest. Historians also argue that the human cost to German flak crews was extremely high, and that the quality of many late-war crews declined as casualties mounted and training time was reduced. Former Luftwaffe commanders interviewed after the war struggled reconciling what they'd asked of their crews. One general, speaking in the 1960s, tried explaining their impossible position. "We knew casualties were extreme. We knew we were sending boys to man those guns, but what choice did we have? Stop defending our cities?" He paused. "Every gun we silenced meant more bombers reached targets, so we kept guns firing, kept replacing crews, kept pretending we were accomplishing something. In truth, we were feeding our children into a machine that ground them into statistics." Klaus Zimmermann survived the war. In a 1989 interview at age 65, he tried explaining what it meant being a survivor. "I was 19 when I first stood beside an 88, 21 when the war ended. In those 2 years, I served with over 120 different crew members across various batteries. Transfers, replacements, new assignments. I saw dozens of faces. I remember perhaps 40 names. I know the fates of fewer than 20. Most simply disappeared. Killed, wounded, captured, lost." He was quiet for a moment. "After Schweinfurt, I stopped learning names. It hurt less when they died if you didn't know them." Then came the survivor's question. Was it worth it? Did we accomplish anything? His answer was honest. "I don't know. We shot down hundreds of planes. We killed thousands of Allied airmen. But they kept coming. More planes, more bombs, more death. And we kept dying. 4 of every 5 men I served with didn't survive. I don't know why I was the 5th. He touched the table, grounding himself in the present. "The 88 was a beautiful weapon. Elegant engineering. Deadly precise. But beauty doesn't matter when you're dying. Precision doesn't matter when there's 500 bombers overhead and you have 10 shells remaining. We were asked to do the impossible, and we died trying. That's what I remember most. Not victories, but the dying. The endless, futile dying." In Berlin, Hamburg, and Vienna, massive concrete flak towers still stand today, too strong to demolish economically. These fortresses, built to house 88mm and larger guns, protected by walls 3 meters thick, survived the war intact. The crews who manned them didn't. The towers stand now as monuments to futility, impregnable fortresses that couldn't save the men who defended them. In many German military cemeteries, the sections for Luftwaffe anti-aircraft personnel are filled with very young names. Many of the dead were teenagers or men in their early 20s, and a large number of them fell in 1944 and 1945, when the war was already turning hopeless for Germany. The gravestones do not give us exact statistics, but they make one thing very clear. A great many flak gunners died very young, and a large share of them were killed in the final desperate years of the war. Most common rank, enlisted men. Most common cause of death, simply killed in action, usually meaning remains were unrecoverable. The 88mm Flak gun was arguably the best artillery piece of World War II. Versatile, powerful, accurate, ahead of its time. It shot down thousands of aircraft, destroyed thousands of vehicles, killed tens of thousands of enemy soldiers. But ask a survivor about the 88, and they won't discuss technical specifications. They'll talk about friends who died beside it, boys who became statistics, crews replaced, then replaced again, then replaced until no one remained to replace. 4 out of 5 didn't survive. That's not a weapons legacy, that's a massacre. August 17th, 1943, 11:47 in the morning. Klaus Zimmermann watched bombers approach through the Zeiss rangefinder. By sunset, 7 of his crewmates would be dead. But in that moment, they were still alive, still hoping, still believing they might survive. They were wrong. Most of them were wrong. That's why only 1 in 5 survived. That's why we must remember them. Not as statistics, but as the young men they were. Sons, brothers, friends who stood beside their guns and did what they thought was their duty, even as that duty killed them. If this story moved you, if you want to hear more forgotten stories from history, told with honesty and respect for those who lived them, please subscribe to our channel. Every week, we bring you the human stories behind the headlines, the courage, the sacrifice, and the terrible cost of war that textbooks never capture. Hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you never miss a story that deserves to be remembered.